Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Joe Simperman. I'm a City of Cleveland councilperson for Ward 3 and the incoming president of Global Cleveland, and a proud City Club member. I'm pleased today for all of us to introduce and welcome today's speaker, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, Ms. Ann C. Richard. The United States is considered one of the world's top resettlement countries for refugees. And in 2015, the Migration Policy Institute reported the resettlement of nearly 70,000 refugees in the United States of America. Locally, our county has been a proud participant with resettling nearly 3,500 refugees since 2010, including its very first Syrian refugee family just last year in September of 2015. But this represents just a fraction of the number of individuals currently seeking to come here. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, nearly 60 million people, 60 million, were considered refugees in 2014. And nearly all of them are fleeing ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Myanmar, and Central America. It is the highest level of refugees in the world since World War II. The recent vast migration of refugees has strained several European countries. And while Germany has opened its borders to refugees, nations like Sweden estimates rejecting 80,000 asylum seekers in 2016. Denmark recently approved legislation allowing immigration authorities to seize people's valuables worth more than $1,400. The United States and our political leaders are also deeply divided in this issue, but not in the city of Cleveland. Some advocate for a humanitarian approach and encourage the admittance of people to come here, while others demand tighter borders and further restrictions, citing security issues in the wake of attacks in Paris and Lebanon. And meanwhile, Cleveland City Council unanimously passes legislation welcoming all from anywhere to our great city of Cleveland. It is in this context that Assistant Secretary Richard joins us today. She was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration in April of 2012, after an amazing and distinguished career in public policy and foreign relations. She is a native of Riverhead, New York, and Assistant Secretary Richard received her bachelor's degree in foreign service from the great Jesuit Georgetown University, and her master's from the University of Chicago in public policy studies. She began her career as a presidential management intern in 1984. More than any of this, Assistant Secretary Richard embodies the best what it is to be American and what is written in the scriptures: to give those who are hungry when they are hungry, to shelter those when they are in need of shelter, and to provide succor for those who need it. In the Hebrew tradition, she's known for doing something which is repairing the world, known as tikkun olam, and repairing the breach. And in the words of the Quran, she understands that it is important to be merciful above judgment and to give kindness and joy wherever she can. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of the greatest city that welcomes refugees, Cleveland, please join me in a warm welcome to Assistant Secretary Ann C. Richard.
Thank you very much, Councilman. I would like to get you to introduce me everywhere I go from now on. I am delighted to be in Cleveland again. Special thanks to the City Club of Cleveland and the 14 agencies of the Refugee Services Collaborative of Greater Cleveland. And the more I learn about the Refugee Services Collaborative, the more I think this could really be a model for many other cities. So you have a lot to be proud of here in Cleveland. I know that many of you have paid close attention to the refugee and migration crisis that has been unfolding in Europe, the largest that continent has faced in a generation. And I'm sure that you have also been reading about Syria, and overnight we've gotten some promising news coming out of the Munich Security Conference, and there'll be continued conversations today in Geneva about trying to bring a cessation of hostilities to Syria, and also to try to get aid through these dangerous battle lines to people who need it. Half of those who have fled to Europe have been driven from their homes by the tragedy in Syria. And my partner here at lunch, Lean, is a student at Cleveland State, and she is from Damascus, where many of her family still lives. And she's been granted asylum here in the United States. I recently returned from London, where Secretary of State Kerry announced $601 million in humanitarian assistance to help Syrians. That brings total U.S. contributions of humanitarian aid since the start of the violence there to over $5 billion. He also announced another $300 million in development assistance to help educate Syrian youth and children in Lebanon and Jordan. Other nations have been generous as well, and as have Syria's neighbors. The humanitarian response we have mounted is unprecedented, but still, the unmet needs are vast. Inside Syria, the situation has become more urgent. Recently, the UN leaders warned the Security Council that the number of besieged areas in Syria that are hard to reach is growing, and combatants continue to ignore UN resolutions requiring them to give safe passage to aid convoys. The UN reports nearly 500,000 people are now stranded, cut off from aid, and at risk of starvation, which is why these efforts towards peace are so important. Reckless disregard for human life is just one challenge concerned governments and international organizations face. Another is the sheer scale of the crisis and the numbers already displaced. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians have left for Europe in the last year, but the majority of Syrian refugees, more than 4.6 million Syrian men, women, and children, remain in the Middle East. 1 in 5 people living in Lebanon is a refugee from Syria. Lebanon, it's about the size of Connecticut, is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, with a volatile mix of political, demographic, and sectarian pressures and a fragile economy. In Jordan, Syrians are the third wave of refugees to enter the country, after Palestinians and Iraqis. Nearly 80,000 Syrian refugees live in just one camp called Zatri, but the majority, 85%, live in cities and towns and rural communities, often in neighborhoods that were already poor, where water is scarce, social services are strained, hospitals are overcrowded, and schools do not have enough classrooms. Turkey has taken more Syrian refugees than any other country, more than 2.5 million, as well as 200,000 Iraqis, Afghans, and other vulnerable refugees. Its government has spent billions of dollars providing shelter, health care, and other services. But life for refugees is hard there too, in part because they do not speak Turkish. For many Syrian refugee families, years of exile, tedium, and frustration have whittled life down to a daily struggle for survival. Their savings are exhausted, and many in cities and towns are falling deeper and deeper into poverty. The heartbreaking stories we have all read of families fleeing bullets and bombs in the Middle East, crowding into flimsy rafts, capsizing and drowning, these stories are part of a global phenomenon. Around the world, as the councilman said, more people are now forcibly displaced than at any time since World War II. And you heard 60 million people around the world are struggling to make it day to day, having been driven from their homes. So today I want to tell you about refugees, internally displaced persons, and migrants, how they are similar and different, and what more we can do to help them. So let's start by asking why record numbers of people are on the move. In the past 5 years, in a long list of countries, violence has erupted, smoldered, or flared anew. In the Middle East, conflict has ravaged not just Syria, but Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza. In Africa, it has terrorized and scattered civilians in the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, northeastern Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Burundi, and Somalia. In Ukraine, Burma, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, violence and persecution continues to uproot people as well. Today's conflicts are not just numerous, they are often brutal, chronic, and intractable. Long-term, unceasing violence or oppression means that uprooted people aren't able to go home. 45% of refugees today are displaced for 5 years or more. These are not short-term emergencies, unfortunately. A child born in a refugee camp at the start of a crisis will often spend his or her entire childhood away from home. In some situations, camp midwives deliver the grandchildren of the original refugees. So refugees numbered 20 million last year and make up just one segment of the population that's on the move. The legal definition of a refugee is someone who has fled across international borders because they have a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And this is the traditional definition that's both international and the US government's definition. But most of the 60 million people displaced globally are not refugees. Approximately 38 million are internally displaced persons, also called IDPs, who have not crossed international borders. For instance, when the Islamic State, ISIL, or Daesh seized roughly a third of Iraq, more than 3 million people fled, not to neighboring countries, but to other parts of Iraq, especially the Kurdish areas in the northeast of the country. Internally displaced persons do not enjoy the same type of protection that refugees do under international laws and treaties. Responsibility for helping IDPs rests primarily with their own governments, and sometimes these governments are the problem. Syria is home to about 7 million IDPs, or 1/5 of the world's total, and the Assad regime drops barrel bombs on its own people, destroying hospitals and schools, and killing rebels and civilians alike. In South Sudan, leaders have put their own feuds ahead of the welfare of their people, repeatedly pushing the country to the brink of famine, ensuring that one of the world's poorest countries remains that way. Despite the recently signed peace agreement, government and opposition forces continue to violate the ceasefire they agreed to honor. And we have a colleague here at the head table today who came from South Sudan, then Sudan, about 14 years ago, is that right? Okay. And is now a fellow Clevelander. Combatants also thwart efforts to help. The Geneva Conventions state that non-combatants must be treated humanely. International humanitarian law prohibits directing attacks against civilians, including civilian aid workers delivering assistance. But militias and governments alike flout these rules. Despite UN Security Council resolutions authorizing the delivery of aid into Syria, humanitarian workers continue to be harassed, threatened, or even killed. In South Sudan, combatants have attacked food convoys, kidnapped and killed aid workers, and fired mortars and rocket-propelled grenades into United Nations compounds where terrified civilians had sought refuge. So let's review. Refugees are people who leave their own country to save themselves from persecution or war, and internally displaced people, or IDPs, are those who flee the violence but try to survive within the boundaries of their own home. So who are the migrants? A migrant is anyone on the move from country to country. A migrant can be a hotly recruited technology expert with a visa for a job in Silicon Valley, or a poor person without papers, willing to take any job. Like IDPs and refugees, migrants are on the move to find a better place with better opportunities for the future. And like IDPs and refugees, migrants traveling without documents can be exceptionally vulnerable. Last spring, Americans were shocked by images of half-starved people from Bangladesh and Burma abandoned on boats by ruthless smugglers. We are growing used to reports of boats sinking and capsizing in the Mediterranean, drowning hundreds of migrants at a time. Economic migrants suffer alongside refugees. Both are subject to the same threats of abuse or abandonment and can be crammed into the same trucks, cages, and leaky rubber boats. In Malaysia and Indonesia, traumatized Bangladeshis told me about being starved and beaten by the crews on ships and seeing bodies dumped overboard. Sovereign nations, of course, are not obligated to or capable of opening their borders to everyone seeking a better life. But migrants need to be carefully screened and treated with dignity. They should be protected if being sent home would put them at risk. So now that I have thoroughly depressed you over this lovely dinner, let me talk a little bit about what the United States is doing. The United States is a world leader in contributing to humanitarian operations around the world, chiefly by working with the top UN and other international organizations in this field. My bureau funds the UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, and others. The Agency for International Development funds the World Food Program. Together, we channel relief dollars through other UN agencies you've heard of, like UNICEF, and through the best non-governmental organizations and charities that work in this field. These operations deliver essential life-saving assistance, food, shelter, medical care, and clean water and sanitation. They protect the rights of the displaced, care for survivors of sexual violence, reunify families, educate children and youth, and help people gain the skills they need to be self-sufficient. Refugee resettlement is another way we help those in danger. This program identifies some of the world's most vulnerable refugees, brings them here, and offers them a fresh start. The United States resettles more refugees than all other countries combined. Most refugees get jobs, enroll their children in school, pay taxes, and after 5 years, as demonstrated by Thomas here today, many choose to take the test to become naturalized American citizens. They contribute immeasurably to the life of our nation. In the city of Cleveland, we actually have very good data on the economic impact of resettling refugees. Between 2000 and 2012, Cleveland absorbed just over 4,500 refugees, mostly from Bhutan, Ukraine, Burma, and Somalia. According to the Cleveland case study, the newcomers typically found employment within 5 months, even though many could not speak English. In Cleveland, as elsewhere, refugees go on to open successful businesses and help revitalize neighborhoods. In 2012, resettlement agencies in Cleveland together spent around $4.8 million assisting refugees. But economists estimate that the Cleveland area gained 10 times that much, $48 million, from the additional economic activity the refugees generated, the new businesses, jobs, and consumer spending. That same year, as a result, the Cleveland area took in an additional $2.6 million in tax revenue. The United States is increasing the number of refugees we resettle each year from 70,000 last year to 85,000 this year and 100,000 or more in future years. As you may have heard, this year we will accept at least 10,000 refugees from Syria. Now, some critics say that number is too low. Others oppose admitting Syrians, arguing that terrorists may seek to enter the United States disguised as refugees. The U.S. government is taking every possible precaution to make sure that doesn't happen. It is important to understand the differences between what is happening in Europe, where thousands of refugees and migrants arrive every day, walking into countries, and what happens when we resettle refugees here in the United States. The U.S. government screens refugees while they are still overseas and before they are admitted to the United States in a process that is rigorous and deliberate. Refugees are subject to the highest level of security checks of any category of traveler to the United States. The Department of Homeland Security, other intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and the Departments of State and Defense all take part in this. Refugees who are found to pose a security concern are not permitted to travel to the United States. Refugees about whom we have doubts are also held back until their cases are resolved. Among those we admit are the most vulnerable Syrians, including female-headed households and their children, survivors of torture, and individuals with severe medical conditions. Admitting more of the world's most vulnerable people is just one way we are responding to emergencies in Syria and elsewhere. As the world struggles to cope with brutal wars and mounting needs, U.S. humanitarian aid and diplomacy are vital. In crisis after crisis, we have been able to spearhead the international response and use our influence to keep borders open and aid flowing, and this has saved millions of lives. But today, aid groups are stretched thin. Last year, the World Food Program, and the U.S. is the top donor to the World Food Program. Last year, the World Food Program was forced to cut food rations to Syrian refugees in the Middle East. This may have been one of the triggers of the large-scale migration to Europe. In fact, all of the UN humanitarian organizations are grappling with severely insufficient funds to address a long list of crises. The United Nations sought $19.5 billion for humanitarian assistance last year, and it received only half of what it was looking for. How can we close this yawning gap? Well, I think private giving could help. I will tell you what happened last September when the image of Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian toddler, lying drowned on a Turkish beach, broke hearts around the world. Within just 1 week, donations for the U.S. fund for UNICEF jumped more than 600%. The charity Save the Children raised 4 times more in that week than it had over the previous 8 months. This is a big change from previous patterns of giving, and the question for me is whether this level of engagement will last. In general, even people who give generously for disaster relief tend to shy away from man-made crises. After Haiti's devastating 2010 earthquake, Americans contributed generously. In fact, I read that half of all American households contributed something to Haiti relief. In contrast, for the first 4 years of the Syria crisis, private donations barely registered, and I think this has to change. Private donors may be reticent because man-made crises can be messy and complex. Image after image of bombings, barbed wire, and misery can be overwhelming, even numbing. But 7 million children have been affected by Syria's crisis. Millions have suddenly found themselves impoverished. Families have married off young daughters and sent young sons out to work because they would otherwise go hungry or have no money for rent. Children have missed years of school, and many have been traumatized. A whole generation urgently needs help and care, and this is why my colleagues and I support the No Lost Generation campaign, launched by UN agencies and non-governmental organizations. I encourage university students and those who want to do more to contact No Lost Gen, G-E-N, at state.gov. We also have a White House website, which is aidrefugees.gov. To cope with the magnitude of these crises, we also need more nations to contribute what they can. Countries already shouldering enormous responsibilities deserve our help. Because of Syria's war, Germany now leads the world in taking in asylum seekers or refugees who travel on their own to a new country and then petition to stay. According to UNHCR, Turkey now hosts more refugees than any other nation, and as I mentioned, Lebanon has absorbed so many Syrians that every 5th person living there is now a refugee. But other nations, too, are coping with large influxes of people in need. Uganda accepts refugees from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, and Burundi, and allows them to work and to farm to support themselves. Ethiopia hosts refugees from Eritrea in the north, Sudan and South Sudan in the west, and Somalia in the south. 2 years ago, I traveled to Burkina Faso, and I was amazed because the people of Burkinabe, had not only opened their borders to refugees from Mali, They had let them bring their cattle and other animals and shared their pasture lands. So I felt that there was a first time for everything, and that this was my first time meeting refugee animals. But this was incredibly generous. The same handful of nations that always provides financial backing for aid operations is doing it now. In addition to the United States, these traditional donors include Western European governments, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and more recently, Korea. At critical junctures in the past few years, the Saudis, Kuwaitis, and Emiratis have given hundreds of millions of dollars to help cope with the emergencies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. But donations from the Gulf countries have not always flowed through United Nations agencies and tend to come as one-off, unique contributions. I would like to see those countries become regular annual donors and contribute through the top-notch aid agencies. This can ensure funding is not wasted and is well allocated and coordinated. We also would like to see some of the world's other economic and politically powerful nations like Russia, India, and China more engaged on humanitarian issues. In addition to rallying more donors, we are adapting to changing needs and new technology to making humanitarian aid more efficient. You wouldn't necessarily know this, since it's easiest for journalists to photograph refugees in camps, but the majority of the refugees today actually live in cities and towns. Instead of handouts, they may need to be handed an ATM card, or better yet, a work permit. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, vulnerable groups such as women and children, the elderly, and the disabled need aid tailored for them. Relief and development experts need to collaborate to help countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Chad, Niger, that have taken in huge numbers of refugees despite their fragile economies. Development agencies can build more classrooms, hospital wards, and water systems so that societies hosting refugees do not suffer for having done the right thing. The Syria Pledging Conference I just attended in London is just the first in a series of high-profile meetings and summits this year that will offer a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make real progress in modernizing the humanitarian system so that it can meet today's challenges. In May, world leaders will gather for a World Humanitarian Summit, and they will convene again in September at the annual United Nations General Assembly. In New York, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will convene a major event on refugees and migrants, and President Obama will host a summit of nations that agree to make significant new commitments to aid refugees. As we look towards the President's Summit, the United States will be seeking a 30% increase in global humanitarian funding and commitments from at least 10 new nations to contribute regularly to new appeals. The United States will also be asking the international community to double the number of refugees offered safety, either through resettlement or through other legal ways to live, work, or study abroad. And we will seek to help nations that are hosting refugees to get 1 million more refugee children into school and 1 million more adults the right to hold jobs legally while living in exile. So today, the world is paying attention. A grim procession of wars and abuses and the crisis reaching Europe have thrust refugees into the spotlight. From ordinary citizens who offer sandwiches to new arrivals, to European leaders, to the President of the United States, people recognize that much more must be done. Humanitarians cannot end the world's suffering as long as savagery and persecution continues. Our government must stay vigilant and engaged and take whatever action we can to stop ethnic, religious, and political rivalries from exploding into violence. We must do what we can to prevent life from being so bleak that risking death to escape seems preferable. We must also see refugees and others cast adrift by conflict for what they are, people not that different from us, who want to work and take charge of their own destinies. She is determined to survive. They are determined to make a better life for their children. Their courage and insistence on leading peaceful, dignified lives are a powerful rebuke to the bigotry and brutality that has chased so many people from their homes. Despite borders and barriers, despite our different circumstances, our fates are linked, and their fight should not only be theirs, but our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary. Today we have enjoyed a Friday forum featuring Ann C. Richard, Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. We're about to head in to our infamous question and answer session, where we welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our radio broadcast, webcast, or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow Branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Multiple media production is provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, and WCLV Classical 104.9 IdeaStream. Our partnership with IdeaStream is generously funded by Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund with generous support from the Raskin Family Fund at PNC. Please be sure to join us Wednesday, February the 17th, as we host a panel discussion on the implications for a new policy for Cuba. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Our community partners for today's forum are Global Cleveland and the Refugee Services Collaborative of Greater Cleveland. We thank you both for your support. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by Catholic Charities Migration and Refugee Services, International Services Center, and Rosner, Ortman, and Moss Partners, LLC. We thank each and every one of you for your amazing support. We also welcome students to today's forum from St. Martin de Porres High School. Are you the Lions? Student participation is made possible by a generous grant from the Laub Foundation. We thank you all for your support. Now it's time to return to Secretary Richard for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We want to encourage you to make sure your questions are brief and to the point, and in fact questions, meaning that they are questions and not statements. Holding the microphones today are Marketing and Outreach Fellow Faye Walker and Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg. May we please have the first question? Teddy. Secretary, would you come?
Good afternoon. You addressed the national security issues regarding refugees coming to this country. How do you respond to those who want to basically close our borders because they don't feel that refugees, migrants, provide any economic benefit or are an economic detriment to our country?
Well, on the economic issue, I would say look at Cleveland. And I guess it's the Cleveland Foundation that did the study that I referenced. And we don't have enough of those studies to make the case. But I think the facts do support refugees as economic engines. You would not find a more motivated workforce than among the companies that hire refugees. And so the refugees themselves speak the loudest on this, not by their voices, but by their performance. The national security issue is what has gripped Washington since the Paris bombings, because some of the people involved in the Paris bombings may have come through the same route of travel from Turkey by boat to Greece and onward. But let's understand then that we are talking about a small number of really horrible terrorists and a very, very large number of innocent civilians who are the victims of terrorists. It's that group, the latter group, the innocent people, that we seek to help. We've seen that bringing refugees to the United States is the right thing to do, and it also benefits our country. And we end up with people in our country in the first or second generation who speak hard-to-find foreign languages. Like I say, they're highly motivated. They give back in so many ways, even if they're on public services for the first year or two, like some of the very vulnerable cases we bring here. When they get employed, they end up paying more in taxes than they ever benefited from in the early parts of their life here in the States. It is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure that we do everything humanly possible to prevent anyone with bad intentions from exploiting this program and getting to the United States. And so this is taken very seriously in the Obama administration and among the collection of intelligence, law enforcement, diplomatic, defense agencies that are working in Washington. And it's gotten a lot of attention in recent years. So is it perfect? Well, because we're dealing with human beings, I don't think we can say this is an imperfect endeavor, but I do think it's a very well thought through, very well constructed, robust screening process. Now, I mentioned in my formal talk, we get criticized for just being so slow in bringing people here. It takes 18 to 24 months. We are trying to speed that up a bit, but not in any way that cuts corners on security. And we have sort of opened our books to members of Congress, to senators, to learn about our screening process in all the detail. And people who've really dived into it, it's run by the Department of Homeland Security, but very much in partnership with us, have come to conclude that it is a very, very careful, rigorous process.
Thank you for coming to Cleveland. My question deals with the difficulty of vetting refugees, those from areas of Syria and Iraq that are under the control of a stateless group that I won't mention to give them the honor, and with false documents, and the difficulty of vetting refugees that were already partially vetted by the U.S. military for their service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and others. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This follows on to what we were just talking about. So we have people fleeing from Syria who we don't know a lot about. Maybe they were poor, they lived in rural areas, their lives have been torn apart, they headed for the exits, and they now live in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. And so we don't have files on them. This is normal for any refugee population, that we start from zero. And so what the very well-trained interviewers from the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services learn to do is to go through an incredibly thorough interview. I've sat through these, where they very patiently, very respectfully, but very persistently ask questions and find out the story of the refugee. Sometimes they have documents. Actually, Syrians tend to have their documents with them, but not all refugee populations do, especially if they've fled in a crisis. They may not have a dossier of their birth certificate and tax receipts and things. So those documents are looked at, but the documents are not the only piece of information used to tell their story, because as you point out, sometimes there's false documents. So we have to be careful not to fall victim to that. But they know to ask, if you say you're from this neighborhood in this city, where was the school? And then they have to know how to answer very in-depth questions based on the profiles that have been put together about the places people are coming from. If they say they were in a city on such and such a date, it will, they'll be tested about whether they know what was going on then. Now, there's also, you mentioned, people fleeing Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of them were people who worked alongside U.S. troops, U.S. diplomats, U.S. media, aid agencies. About those people, there are files. And that's where there's more confidence when we have that information about who they are and why they are fleeing. And there's a sense among many in Washington who served in Iraq or who served in Afghanistan that some of these people are in trouble because they helped American forces, and that they should then be helped in return by being admitted to the United States. The hardest cases I have are when I have journalists calling me and saying, this person who was my translator in Iraq got turned down to come to the United States. And I worked alongside this guy. He saved my life. He's perfect. I trust him implicitly. And I have to say, I'm sorry, the Department of Homeland Security makes that decision. They use all the possible information at the disposal of the United States. Some of it unclassified, some of it classified, and it's their decision. I can sometimes get someone to take a second look, but we don't make the decision about who comes.
Hi. You talked a little bit about the intergenerational aspects in camps and things like that. Are our laws and practices regarding refugees strong enough to keep intergenerational families together, like grandmothers? Because that can really be a source of great stability when they relocate to a new country.
Yeah, we do. I mentioned that one of our priorities is to help vulnerable refugees. We also make a priority of family unification or family reunification. You know, what I find is that older generation is among the hardest to integrate into American society. Of course, the little kids are the easiest. You know, they're the ones who learn English the fastest in any family, right? And they end up translating for their parents. But that older generation often is willing to make the sacrifice of their own comfort. And, you know they may never see their homelands again. They know they'll be buried someplace different than where they were born. But for them, it's worth it because they worry about the future of their family. I think this is a very human thing that a lot of us identify with, you know, wanting good things to happen for our kids and grandkids. I don't have grandkids, but kids. I could have grandkids any day, I suppose. But I have a 22-year-old daughter. But we worry, you know, about the future of our families. We want the best for them. And a lot of these people live lives that are uncomfortable. You know, the classic example is it's winter out there today in Cleveland, and some people come from warm places. I'll never forget one of the happiest group of refugees I ever saw were people in a courtyard of the International Organization for Migration in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. They had all been told they were going to the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And they were out there. It wasn't broiling sun, but it was pleasant. I had no coat on. I had like a lightweight jacket. They were out there, the African sun, dressed in newly issued snowsuits. And these kids were standing there like gingerbread cookies, right? They didn't know how to move in them. And they were so happy because they were going to the airport to fly to the United States. So anyway, somewhere in there, I think I answered your question.
Great to see you, Honorable Assistant Secretary, and welcome to Cleveland. My name is George Kusa. I represent the International Community Council and the Intercultural Network, also with Margaret Wang and Associates law firm. I'm from Syria originally, and now you took me back to Aleppo and Raqqa, and I was in college in Syria, in Aleppo. Very emotional. Again, my main question is, what's your take on enforcing a no-fly zone, which will help basically, you know, held by Turkey and other countries, the suffering of the refugees, first of all, and then to put a final solution to this terrible crisis in Syria. So I'd like to hear from that.
The most hopeful thing I can tell you is that I work for someone who is determined to keep trying to bring peace to Syria despite the difficulties of doing so. I have to admire Secretary of State John Kerry because he does not give up. He is incredibly energetic. I complain about traveling too much. He never complains. He gets on the plane. He keeps going. It puts me to shame. It's very tough to work for someone like that who seems indefatigable when he's somewhat older than I am. So that's the good news. I mean, the bad news is that these are really tough situations. For years now, people have suggested safe zones or no-fly zones, In order for that to work, you have to have militaries prepared to protect those. We don't want to set up a so-called safe zone and tell displaced people, go there, it's safe inside Syria in that area, and then have them sitting ducks, have another situation like Srebrenica in the Balkans, and have them bombed. If we're going to encourage people to go to a zone like that, we need an international agreement that such a place would be safe. I think the best chance for peace happened yesterday, and I don't want to oversell it because I think these are really challenging situations. But if we can get the combatants to stop shooting at each other, if we can get the Russians to stop bombing, if we can get Assad to stop barrel bombing his own people and let the aid go through, maybe there can be a chance then for some talks that would start to knit together at least some parts of the country. I certainly hope so.
Secretary Richard, thank you for your remarks. I'm wondering if you could talk about the recent NATO initiative to send ships to the Aegean and how this is going to help rather than hurt refugees.
Well, it's a very timely question. This only came up this week. I haven't seen the original document that was that's being discussed inside NATO about what they have in mind. I did notice that a good piece of this was that they're talking about cracking down on smugglers. They're not talking about cracking down on migrants. Who are the innocent people. They're talking about cracking down on the guys who are exploiting refugees and migrants, telling them it's safe to take these rickety boats across and taking their life savings and then sending them to their deaths. So the 3 ships that they're intending to deploy to the Aegean that would be supplementary to the coast guards of Turkey and Greece could potentially be a good thing. And like I say, their sensitivity that they've already expressed in looking at this is potentially a good thing, but we'll have to look at the details. It's certainly not, not the first choice to go to militaries when you're talking about a humanitarian crisis. I think the fact that people are trying to think of these out-of-the-box solutions shows the difficulties that we've encountered over 5 years, coming up on 5 years in March, of trying to do something about these poor people who've been fleeing. I've been to Jordan 8 times and Turkey, I think, 4 times, and I was, last time I was there, they said, is this your first time here? I said, no. But they were used to people saying, yes, I'm from Europe and I have just discovered there's a crisis here. So, I think this is one of the things that's been quite good about the U.S. approach to this, is that we were involved early. We met early with the governments. We met early with the non-governmental organizations, the internationals, but also the local groups. I meet with them every time I go back. My colleagues do. We care about what's going on, and our frequent presence there demonstrates that. But over time now, people, understandably, as this goes from a short-term emergency to a protracted situation, people are very, very worried and are looking at sort of any possible new opportunities, new openings to make a difference.
Good morning. We are from St. Martin de Porres, and excuse me. One of our questions are, what are the strict regulations to allow refugees and immigrants in the United States?
And the other part of the question is, how do refugees and migrants pass the strict regulations imposed by the U.S. to come into the United States?
Okay, well, you'll have to stick around after the lunch and talk to some of the people who actually have managed to come here as refugees, who are here. They're just sitting closer to the podium than you are, high school students, but they're here too. And I think what they'll tell you is that they have to be referred by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR agency, as people who fit that profile of having been persecuted because of their race, nationality, religion, membership in a social group, or political beliefs, and that they have a story to tell that stands up to scrutiny about how they are innocent and they are in need and they can never go home again. Like, take someone who's like a torture victim in one of Assad's prisons and their family has been killed. You know, that's a lot to expect them to return to their original neighborhood. Or take somebody who fled a country because of their religion and they were sort of stigmatized or pointed out to authorities or to ISIL, for example, in the Middle Eastern case, because of they belong to a religious minority. They may never want to go home again. And so for those people, I really think that resettlement is a very good answer. Most of the world's refugees, because we talked about 60 million displaced, about 20 million refugees, most of the world's refugees will never go to a new country. Their best chances are either to be accepted in the places where they've fled, or to go home again. And that's why these diplomacy and peace negotiations and the long, tough, not very glamorous work of trying to repair conflict-ridden countries is so important, so that they get a chance to go home again. Thanks for your question. Very well asked.
Good afternoon. Let's go back to the special immigration visas and that you mentioned earlier. And while it was exciting that Obama announced an increase in November, to my understanding that program is closing and those pathways to resettlement here in the U.S. is going to be ending shortly. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and if there's going to be any other way that those individuals will be able to relocate to the U.S.?
Well, that's an excellent question. And, you know, the refugee program does not stop even if we curtail special immigrant visas. Special immigrant visas for people who helped U.S. troops in foreign countries should come to an end sometime after the U.S. troops pull out. The underlying your question, though, is if troops are still in a country, then perhaps that should be relooked. And I think that's a perfectly fair point.
Good afternoon. I was wondering if you could speak to the situation in Central America, those fleeing the violence coming up through Mexico. In fact, there was an article in today's paper, I think it was, or the New York Times, I should say, contrasting Cuban exiles coming in to the country, I think it was through Texas, and the treatment they have because they have status versus those folks fleeing the violence from Central America. And so.
Thank you for your question. A year and a half ago, summer, we saw a spike in the number of unaccompanied children from the northern triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, walking into the United States, having taken very, very dangerous journeys to get here. The question was, what is going on and why are these children showing up here now? And the answer was they were fleeing criminality and gang warfare and narco-traffickers who had made their neighborhoods very, very dangerous for young people. And their families had decided the best thing for these kids was to send them north. And they knew that if kids reached the U.S., we would not send unaccompanied children back. We would try to locate their parents and try to unify the families. And many of them had a parent already in the United States who they were seeking to join. So one of the perplexing things about our refugee law is that it fits the Cuban case well, the traditional Cuban case. If you're a family that's fleeing communism and persecution from the Castro regime, you can be determined to be a refugee. If you're a teenager fleeing gang violence, are you a refugee? Are you an economic migrant? And this is really up to the immigration judges in the United States who are considering their cases for asylum. And we see that some, but not all of them, are being determined to be refugees and are being allowed into the country. So what the president did was he decided, rather than have children have to make this dangerous journey before finding out if they're determined to be a refugee or not, we would set up a brand new program in Central America to say, if your parents are legally present in the United States and you're about to set out to join them, apply to come. We will do a DNA check, and if it matches and your story holds up, we will bring you to the United States to be with your parents who are legally, lawfully present in the United States. Now, the problem with that is, a lot of them had parents who were undocumented in the United States, so that didn't solve everything, but it was a step forward. More recently, you would have heard right around New Year's, we're looking to start a program so that if someone of any age presents themselves to UNHCR, to the UN Refugee Agency in these countries and says, I fear for my life because I'm a member of a particular social group, I'm someone who the gangs have got it in for, can you get me out of here? We might be able to move that person, but that hasn't been completely set up yet. We're still working on that. So these are the two programs I just described are partial solutions. The real solution to this issue is to stop the criminality in these countries, to have peaceful, stable governance and societies. That requires more than a program to bring people here. It requires assistance by the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department and others to try to work with those governments, because it's not the governments persecuting the people, it's these illegal gangs, to try to change what's happening there on the ground. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum with Ann C. Richard, Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Thank you, Ms. Richard, for fighting for all of us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.